Good evening and welcome to the programme with me, Frankie McCamley. We start tonight looking at the impact the COVID pandemic had on the capital nearly 5 years on since the first lockdown. It changed our lives forever and the effects are still being felt. Now a place of reflection, the National COVID Memorial Wall can be found along the Albert Embankment, and it's where we can join Riz Latif this evening. Riz, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, as we mark, as you say, 5 years since the COVID pandemic, at a time that was of deep uncertainty and navigating the unknown, it's the loss of loved ones that this unofficial memorial wall represents. It stretches half a kilometre along the embankment between Westminster and Vauxhall bridges, with each of the thousands and thousands of hearts a dedication to someone who died during the pandemic with COVID-19 listed on their death certificate. We know that it was an incredibly tough time, especially for medical staff working on the front line in our hospitals. Well, my colleague Carl Mercer has been back to St George's Hospital in Tooting to hear from some of those who worked through an unprecedented time.
It's the start of April in 2020. 23-year-old nurse Laura Blackmore is 2 weeks into working in intensive care.
It's actually very tricky emotionally, you know, you've got to kind of just get stuck in and help each other out, really.
Whose hands?
They're my hands.
5 years on, we caught up with Laura and showed her our film from the first wave of COVID. What do you think?
It's difficult watching it back. Obviously I was really scared because we'd had no training at the time, whereas usually there's a whole programme before you join intensive care. And it was really nerve-wracking. I mean, I've never seen so many patient deaths before. I can remember most of the patients, I can remember their faces. I used to come into work one day and it'd be one set of patients, and then the next day it would be all a different set of patients, and it wasn't because they were getting better. So it was scary. Every day was scary. I remember having the visor on and I could just hear my own breath. It was like when you're scuba diving and you can hear your breath over anything else. That's what it was like every day when you'd gown up outside the bays. But I mean, yeah, it was one of the hardest times of my life, for sure.
And it's frustrating, isn't it, when you can't hear?
Laura suffered from anxiety and couldn't work for a while. She's now back, though, as a ward manager, using the lessons she learned in COVID to help her current colleagues, while still trying to cope herself.
I tried to watch, there's a couple of, you know, programmes about it, and I can't watch them at all. It brings all the emotions back. Just the noises. I couldn't go over to the other wing. The smells of the wings in themselves in the wards would bring everything back, and I never thought that that would be the situation at the time, but it's only afterwards. Yeah, I definitely still struggle with it, and I still think about that time all the time.
You see the other side, it could be your mum, your dad, your grand.
Consultant Jane Evans told us the same as she looked back on the material we filmed of her, back when the hospital had doubled the number of its COVID intensive care beds to 120.
So a lot of us felt lucky that we were able to come to work, we were able to feel that we were doing something, but that didn't then detract from how difficult it was to see people. You know, we saw our colleagues get sick. You know, we saw our friends and family get sick. Some people lost friends and family through this time. And so, you know, it was really tough. And that, I think, you know, it just shows how the NHS did pull together and did some really amazing things really quickly.
Relax, relax.
One thing that did emerge from COVID was the ability to transfer critically ill patients between hospitals. A new system called Access was set up, which has now successfully moved more than 3,000 patients. Nirav Shah spent much of COVID in intensive care and saw those upsides, but also the daily struggles.
When you think about where in intensive care normally there's one-to-one nursing, and suddenly we had one nurse looking after 5-6 patients, supported by nurses who've been redeployed from the rest of the hospital. but perhaps were less specialist in what they were doing, and the burden, the mental and physical burden of that was immense. Similarly for the medical team, we were stretching at the new intensive cares week in, week out, and that was a lot of hard work, and I think there was a lot of burnout after that.
And that's a common response from staff here. The physical effects of COVID not necessarily visible, the mental ones still very much so.
Were we to face another pandemic today, would we be better prepared? I'm not sure. Would it be any easier for anyone? I don't think so. You know, would our NHS cope with another onslaught? I'm not sure we would, actually. And I think so. It's a real mixed bag of feelings about it. You know, a sense of pride, but also a sense of real foreboding.
That was St George's, just one of the hospitals, Carl, that you visited during the pandemic. Can I ask, how did it feel going back?
You know what the weird thing was? That those 3 people I went back to see, it was the first time I'd seen their faces. Because when we went 5 years ago, and when we went throughout the campaign or throughout the pandemic, I never saw their faces. They always had masks and visors on, and you heard Laura speaking about that there, didn't you? That the sound of the visor that she had to go through in 12-hour shifts, day after day after day. And I have to say, you know, big thanks to Laura, Nirav and Jane for sharing their memories with us, because they're difficult memories to share. A lot of NHS staff across London have had times that they don't want to remember, but actually can't forget at the same time. You heard Laura talking about that there, didn't you? And there is this thing called moral injury that staff in the NHS talk about, because they're trained, aren't they, to go and help people, to save lives. What they were doing during the pandemic was actually managing death in a lot of cases, something that they're not used to doing, certainly not on that scale, but something they have to live with. And you remember, oftentimes, they were the people that were saying goodbye to people who were dying because the loved ones weren't allowed in. So a really hard time for them to deal with and to remember.
Yeah, as you say, incredibly tough for staff on the front line, and we heard that there. Also some lessons learned as well, they mentioned.
Yeah, and I think the big thing, you heard Nirav talking there about this moving critically ill patients from hospital to hospital. That wasn't something the London hospitals used to do. They used to be quite competitive with each other, but what the pandemic forced them to do was work not just across regions like South West London, but across the whole of the capital. And they developed this system of moving critically ill patients as they were. Because hospitals were so overloaded, they had to share the burden. And there's this new access programme, they call it, where they've now moved something like 3,000 patients across London hospitals. So when the need arises, London's hospitals can deal much better within each other. But there's also another interesting thing about what happens internally in hospitals. Because during COVID, loads of staff were brought in to man and to staff intensive care units, staff who weren't trained to do that. It meant that loads of units across hospitals that never used to speak to each other, never used to know each other, got to know each other. So you now have staff in different units, different wards, who now know each other much better. So it's been much better internally for hospitals as well.
So did you get a sense then of how prepared we seem in the event of something similar happening?
I mean, you certainly get a sense, and you heard Jane reference in it there in the film, that the NHS is still under huge pressure. And I think that is one of the issues for those staff. They went through 2 big waves of COVID, thought we're going to see the light at the end of the tunnel. They haven't. Waiting lists are going up. They know they've got a backlog from COVID. They are still trying to catch up. It's a huge one, something like 1 million people on waiting lists here in London at the moment. We've also got winter pressures. They're still carrying on. Then last week we had a reorganisation of the way the NHS works across the whole country. A lot of scratching heads from chief executives that I've spoken about how that is going to work under these conditions. So yeah, lessons learned. And we also know there is going to be a big emergency exercise, pandemic planning exercise from government and local government, which we're expecting to take place in the autumn as well. So lessons still being learned.
Okay, and meanwhile, of course, the COVID public inquiry goes on. But Carl, for now, thanks very much indeed. Carl Mercer there. Well, let's return for a moment to the wall of hearts behind me.